Okay. Thank you again for coming. We were just
before you ask me the first question, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. We've been talking about this for some time, and I'm glad we were able to give life to a conversation between me and you here in Orange, Connecticut, or for you in Orange, Connecticut, and for your audience. So thank you for that.
Absolutely, and I'm so glad that you can come. Let's see, we were chatting a little before we opened up the doors, and we were talking about how Bart Giamatti went to Yale. Before that, his father, Valentine Giamatti, went to Yale, and he graduated from Yale in 1932. So I wanted to ask you, as a way of getting at what the book has to tell us, could you tell us a little about how Valentine Giamatti went to Yale, and also about the kind of attitudes that he might have encountered during those years?
I'd be glad to, because that really does get to the heart of the way the book begins, and a framework for really thinking about Bart Giamatti's life. Valentine Giamatti was born in New Haven. His parents came from Italy. Father came first before he was married, and then went back, married, and brought his wife and his sister to New Haven. Valentine Giamatti was born in Fairhaven and went to public schools. And he went to Hill House High School. And the relevance of that is in that era, Hill House was in a place called the York Square campus. And for those of you who are familiar with Yale, the Stiles and Morris, the two very contemporary looking modern schools that Yale will never replicate, that was the location for three high schools. And it was called the York Square campus, and all three were located there. It was about a 6-acre site. That's where Valentine Giamatti went to school. And at the time, it was what might be characterized as a feeder school to Yale. Now, what mattered to him was the good fortune of receiving a sterling scholarship for 4 years. And that's the way he was able to go to Yale. And that choice was made largely by the faculty, with only marginal influence from Yale. And Sterling created a scholarship program really focused on students from those three high schools, especially Hill House, and from schools in the region. And it was largely the way students who would never have been admitted to Yale at the time, because of the nature of the discrimination directed against Italian immigrants, Jewish immigrants, Catholics, African Americans, they would never have gotten admitted. So the number of people who came out of that school were small, but very talented. He went to Yale and graduated Phi Beta Kappa after 4 years. And let me add too that he lived at home. He was one of those day students. And so in the one sense, he was able to totally exploit the value of Yale in intellectual terms, but not the culture. He could stay away from that. That continued to come from his parents and his neighborhood. And his son was very conscious of that, because during this time period, there are literally, and there still is, dozens of family members, aunts, uncles, cousins that were in New Haven. So Valentine Giamatti was very much a product of his neighborhood and his family. When he gets to Yale, he confronts something that's very ugly. And I make clear at the outset of the book that to understand Bart Giamatti, you needed to know his parents, his grandparents through them, but you also needed to know Yale's relationship to New Haven historically. And in doing that, you get to sense and realize the depth of the historical knowledge Bart Giamatti had about his father and his father's experience in New Haven. And again, Yale's relationship to New Haven. I'm going to read you this one paragraph because I think it begins the process of answering your question. And if you don't mind, Jonathan, I'm just going to read this paragraph.
Please.
The context for the paragraph is really at the very beginning of the book. And I describe how Valentine Giamatti had to know the Neapolitan language, a dialect of Italian, in order to speak to his mother. She was fully literate, but not in English. His father was literate, but he had to retain that knowledge. And in the public schools at the time, literally there was corporal punishment if you spoke Italian or if you spoke a foreign language, any foreign language. There was ridicule, there was physical abuse. It was very different than it is today. And so he was constantly challenged in school about not doing that. The consequence was that he resisted that. So I'm going to begin this paragraph with that knowledge in mind. That is, he kept the language. He kept the Neapolitan as well as learning what was then called model Italian. Preserving the critical thread of language in the families and his neighborhood's culture, resisting the force to abandon it, was among the simpler duties Valentine insisted on fulfilling. From the moment his parents sought to disembark at Ellis Island, through his entrance into Yale's graduate program, he witnessed and felt the prejudice against Southern Italians that Northern Italians brought to Yale University, and the way that prejudice combined and was amplified publicly and deliberately with the insidious Anglo-Saxon imperative for the purity of its own culture. Quote, "It seems quite clear," Yale President James Roland Angell wrote in 1933, as he surveyed the Italian and Jewish immigrant and African-American population that surrounded the university, that if we could have an Armenian massacre confined to the New Haven district, with occasional incursions into Bridgeport and Hartford, we might protect our Nordic stock almost completely, unquote. That does two things. It sets a tone. It sets a tone for the book, and it sets a tone for the life of both Valentine Giamatti and his son. It also has very practical consequences, and for those people living in Orange who have some recollection of this, either through their own experiences or their families, that Armenian massacre happened in New Haven. 30,000 people were displaced for urban renewal. They lost their homes, they lost their neighborhoods, they lost family structure, they lost a lot of culture, and many of them left New Haven and moved out to the suburban communities, including Orange. Others stayed and moved to other parts of the city. But it's a very ugly, ugly part of the city's history, and the singular beneficiary was Yale, and it was deliberate. They were very conscious of precisely how to benefit from urban renewal, and they got the cooperation of Dick Lee and others in his administration that ensured they had firsthand knowledge of what was going to happen and how to exploit it, and they did. So that just sort of sets a tone. There are some precise things I could talk about in terms of immigration and race and so on, but let's begin with that and go to your next question.
Well, sure. Valentine Giamatti was a Dante scholar. He went on to teach at Mount Holyoke in South Hadley. That's where Bart Giamatti was born and grew up. You have a wealth of detail in your book about Bart's boyhood and his involvement with sports. Could you say something about how that related to his later career?
I could, and I will. And actually, Jonathan, this might be an appropriate time for you to put up that photograph.
Oh, yeah.
For those who are listening, this photograph is actually in the book. And it was one that his friends, I had the benefit of interviewing not only his brother and sister and cousins, but also his childhood friends. And this was a photograph they all talked about. And I'm going to read you another paragraph, if you don't mind, because I think it captures this photograph. That's Bart Giamatti on the right. They are in the center school, it's called, a grammar school that went up to 8th grade. And he's with his friends there. I'm just going to read you a couple of paragraphs because it really touches on this. And you should keep, so it's clear, and really to be responsive to Jonathan's question, you should keep baseball in mind. You should keep Pete Rose in mind. You should keep his parents in mind, because this is the way it evolves for him. And this was just one classic example of it. Bart also enjoyed and excelled in the intensity of playing touch football. He was the quarterback, the play caller, the strategist, the passer, the team leader. The context mattered. It wasn't just that you could play with only 4 players in a yard or on the street. Once Bart reached 5th and 6th grade at center school, he played regularly on the adjacent field at lunchtime, during exercise class, on Saturdays. More importantly, by 7th and 8th grade, he played in the citywide grammar school league that required regular interaction with the sometimes bigger, no-nonsense tough boys from the factory worker families who lived in South Hadley Falls, boys he'd meet again in high school. Center school had its own tough kids. One photograph came quickly to the mind of his friends, Andy, Bill, and Gene, as if it were iconic. On the center school field, the huddle, everyone bent over or crouched down, heads close together and peering inward, backs and rears only visible to the chronicler, the team ready for direction. And among them, the boy standing tall, surveying the field before calling the play, the quarterback, Bart Giamatti. His friends made clear that from the outset, Bart was neither intimidated nor discomforted by playing against tough boys or befriending them. He'd watched his father do it regularly in life. They'd agreed on the rules of the game and stuck to them. Order meant fairness. For as skinny a kid as he was, on the field, neither size nor the seemingly unintentional block that sent him sprawling deterred his persistence or disrupted his focus. He was fearless. I think the value of this, of what I just read to you and looking at that photograph, is it shows right at the outset of his life, derived from a number of settings, but mostly his parents. This notion of fairness and how rules ensured fairness, that you couldn't be exploited. And that really does play out throughout his entire life, including his time at Yale, where he confronts his own form of the President Angel discrimination, the ugliness of the kind of eugenics mentality. So athletics was a critical part of his life, and baseball was especially important. There's oftentimes it's said, and I've read it many times, that he acquired his love for the Boston Red Sox because he lived in Massachusetts. Well, in fact, it really comes from his grandmother. She was the one who liked the Boston Red Sox and followed it as a young girl through her own experiences in college, and actually followed it very closely, watched Ted Williams play when he was a young kid, knew all about baseball. And she was the one who passed it on to his father, and from the father to the son.
Well, that is unexpected. The book actually starts with a wonderful scene on an ocean liner where Bart's future parents are about to meet. And in some ways, they would be an unusual couple. The Red Sox fan, it sounds like you're telling me, was his father's mother.
It was mother's mother.
His mother's mother, right.
Mother's mother, yeah.
That's right, because they were Massachusetts people. But who were they? You know, tell us a little bit about them and how they met.
I will. The book begins with the kind of serendipitous experience where Bart's father was awarded a travel grant to go to Italy and the money was really raised by citizens in New Haven, although it was a formal program. And when he goes alone, and it turns out he's going at the same time that Bart's mother-to-be, Mary Walton, and she is if you go back ancestrally, she goes back to the Mayflower, actually. But there's some very interesting evolution in her life, which is Boston, which was where many of the people lived, this first group of residents in America, or among the first group of residents in America, was very Calvinist. And which is a very harsh and rough and condescending, elitist sort of view of the world. Her family, however, broke away from that. They did not settle in Boston. They settled in Maine and parts of Massachusetts and became Congregationalists, which was much more of a democratically oriented religious set of beliefs. And so she had a whole different history from the classic white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And when she was ready to go to school, she went to Smith, and the family, her mother had gone to Smith. She had sisters, they did as well. Unlike them, however, she studied Italian and Italy. And so she became very familiar with its history, with its culture, and especially with its language. And it was that interest that put her on the same ship as Valentine Giamatti, which is, again, the way the book begins. And that's where they met. And so you can see, just from my brief description, that she had in her life not only a deep interest in Italian, in Italy, in the language, in the culture, all of which melded very much with her husband's to-be, his interests. That's really the way they met. But she also was not your classic white Anglo-Saxon Protestant of that era. And so that lent itself to a whole different form of community involvement, of active citizenship in places they lived. And so all of that then gets played out not only in their lives, but again in the lives of their children, especially their son.
Yeah. Let's see. I'm sorry, I'm getting a technical message here. It looks like I have to do something to make sure that we don't get cut off. Bart then would eventually follow in his father's footsteps. He attended Yale and he graduated in 1960. And the 1950s, when he was there, was when the urban renewal was happening that you started to tell us about before. I learned a lot about that from reading your book. Could you give us an idea of what happened?
I can. And let me preface this by saying, I thought I knew it as well. I'm from New Haven. This is a history I'm familiar with. And coming back and forth over time and being the product of, my mother was born in Italy, actually. And so I was very sensitive to these issues as urban renewal evolved. I really didn't know it as well as I do today. Urban renewal in New Haven was never intended to benefit New Haven. That was not publicly discussed. It was really intended to benefit a mythical, largely fictional entity called the Quinnipiac Valley region. When I say fictional, I literally mean fictional. It was in the head of the planner from Yale that New Haven retained and for many years ignored until Dick Lee became mayor, and then they embraced him. And they embraced him to implement a plan that, again, was not intended to benefit New Haven, but rather this region. And by doing that, it's only by understanding that you can understand why this gigantic roadway was constructed into the center of New Haven. And why these two wide swaths of land going in and out of the city were constructed, because it was never intended to benefit the city. And so it was, how do you get people in and out? And it didn't matter that New Haven was losing population, people were leaving, people were relocating, people were forced to relocate in huge numbers. 30,000 is 20% of the population. And throughout that time period, Yale was intimately involved in every one of those decisions. And it plays out in the most practical way possible, which is the acquisition of land, the knowledge of what's going to occur someplace. For those who look closely at some of this, you can see a suburban mentality that gets imposed on New Haven in a way that was totally antithetical to its history. And the beneficiary was Yale. And in so many ways, you can see it in where the hospital is located. That used to be a vibrant, active neighborhood. And not just a neighborhood. There were hundreds of solid buildings, office buildings that were demolished, businesses that were demolished. It wasn't really until the early 60s that an effort began and it really started to come out of the neighborhoods, an anger and a frustration over how do we stop this? But the harm at that point was already done. Now, Bart Giamatti goes back to New Haven in 1956 to become, with his parents, they take him to school. He gets into Yale, and he witnesses exactly what it is I just described. And it's during that time period that it really develops his disdain for Dick Lee, which lasted the rest of his lifetime. And he came to appreciate the enormity of the harm that was being done in New Haven, including by Yale. And let me go back to something I was alluding to earlier. What his father figured out, and it was not unusual for these day students, what his father figured out was how to fully exploit the intellectual value and the seriousness of the opportunities Yale afforded without getting entangled in the culture. Bart knew that as well. Now, he was living there, so the challenge for him was greater, but he knew how to do it, and he did do it. But at the same time, recognized precisely what was going on around him. And it's during this time period that the York Square campus gets sold to Yale for a ridiculously low price. And it's a pretty shameful, it's a pretty shameful event in the history of New Haven, but it tells you something about Yale's relationship, its ability to exploit what it needed to in order to acquire what it wanted.
Yeah. Folks, I have an unusual request to make. I'm going to have to end the meeting and then start it again because I slipped up a little bit and I started it with the wrong settings. So it's about to end. So I'm going to end the meeting. I'm going to ask you all to come right back because I'm going to start it up again and then there won't be a time limit on it. And I apologize for this. But especially you, Neil, and also every one of our audience members. I'm going to end this now, and I'm going to ask you to come back immediately if you could. Let's see. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming back. I think we got over that little hump. Hello, Neil. I'm so glad to see you again. So yeah, that was a terrible thing that happened in New Haven. I'm afraid I may have cut you off while you were talking about it. Let's see, and you, Neil, are muted. Let's see if we can get you unmuted.
Does that work?
Yep, there we go. Now I can hear you.
That's great.
Yeah.
And Jonathan, I'm prepared to stay a little bit longer if you want to,
Yeah,
if there are interesting questions and so on.
that would be great.
Yeah, of course.
Let me let these other people back in. Okay, here we go again. So yeah, so Bart Giamatti eventually earned a doctorate at Yale and joined the faculty later. And at that time, the president of Yale was a man named Kingman Brewster, the quintessential WASP. But I was surprised when I read in your book about how Brewster originally rose to prominence during his own undergraduate years. Could you talk about that and about Brewster's values in general? What was in place at Yale?
Well, let me just say there's no substitute for reading it, but I'll try to summarize it for you.
Sure.
He was the quintessential white Anglo-Saxon Protestant at a time when Yale was almost exclusively that, where wealth was prominent, where it was a very conservative school and as it still is actually, contrary to whatever you may think about its reputation in terms of what the faculty does and so on. The university is a very conservative place, and it has been historically, and he was as well. And one of the things that he does while a student, and it's been sort of distorted historically until you look at the actual archival documents at Yale, and you do a little serious research, that he had a deep support in his experience, and it lasted throughout his lifetime, for Charles Lindbergh. And Lindbergh at the time was a strong, this is in the 30s, late 30s, was a strong supporter of Germany, of Hitler, of fascism. And he also was a deep believer in eugenics. And that is, that quote from, that I read at the beginning and that you asked about from President Angel about the Armenia massacre, that is about eugenics. He was the quintessential leader at Yale and helped form the faculty around that idea. And it really has to do with determining who's fit and who's unfit. And it lasted formally in the law in Connecticut from roughly 1911 through the late 60s. And so eugenic as a law and this has to do with institutionalizing people who were unfit and sterilizing them. And Connecticut was at the forefront of doing that. And so before we get to Wilbur Cross, who turns out to be a very prominent leader in that, let's come back to Brewster. Lindbergh believed in all of that. And so when the Second World War became likely, Brewster and a few of his colleagues at Yale supported Lindbergh's view that the United States should let the Germans do whatever they wanted to do in Europe. And at that point, it was well known in settings that mattered about what the Germans actually were doing with eugenics, but especially with Jews. So Brewster embraces Lindbergh. And it's a long history, and it says a lot about him in my mind, but his own words and Lindbergh's words say it all. And again, I alluded to this about the research. All of what I describe in this book, or most of it that's consequential, comes right out of the Yale archives. This was not, I didn't have to make it up. This is there. And you may not hear of it for reasons that I earlier alluded to, which is the faculty is sort of timid about going after its own or being critical of its own university. But that's where it is. And Brewster embraced that. And So he had a long history that flows from that mentality. And later when he comes back to Yale, first as the provost and then as the president of the university, when things really, he's severely criticized in two ways. One is total lack of belief in the First Amendment. So he had no compunction at all about stopping people from speaking or restricting them or denigrating them. It was just not his, he didn't have a firm belief in that. But the second thing is when New Haven was really feeling the serious consequences from urban renewal, when it appeared as if it was likely there would be something in the nature of a civil disturbance. He was warned. Dick Lee was warned. Didn't matter. And so when it finally erupts right on Yale's periphery, in what New Haven used to be characterized as the sort of Legion Avenue part of the city, when it finally erupts, the older members of the community and the NAACP go to Kingman Brewster 3 times. They also go to all the churches in New Haven and out in, as far as North Haven and Hamden, and they go to private residences and say, please, if you would, as this is evolving, it could be very violent. There could be killings. There could be accidental disruptions of homes. Would you please take the children and the women and house them for a few nights? Well, the churches responded as far away as North Haven and Hamden. Churches throughout New Haven responded. Private residents opened their place up for children and women. Yale refused. And it was Brewster personally who refused to do it. And it was so reflective of his detachment from New Haven and from the people around New Haven. And it was something that Giamatti learned from, something he disliked. So Brewster, who's often credited with, I don't know, being something in the nature of liberal, and it's a term I just don't use in the book because he hardly was. It was all his skill at being very pragmatic and knowing what to say when he needed to say it. But in terms of being thoughtful and sensitive and a responsible citizen in New Haven, not even close.
Got it. So the book leads up to the moment when Bart Giamatti is about to succeed Kingman Brewster as the president of Yale. From that point on, I know that the information available is limited because the papers from his presidency are sealed. And for that reason, I believe you don't actually cover the story from then on. But my question is, will those papers become available at some point? And do you think you might write the rest of the story?
Well, they will become available. I think there's some years off into the future, but let me make a couple of observations that might add some clarity with respect to both your question and an answer. The last 6 or 8 pages of the book, which I call epilogue, in epic battle, actually, really do talk about threads in his presidency that I felt comfortable talking about. And one of those was the discrimination he confronted right off. From the moment he was selected, he really felt the prejudice from being an Italian American on his father's side and the way that played out. Now, there are 2 articles that I've written, which I know you've seen, and your viewers they're posted online. They're actually posted in my own website, which you can get to by just Googling my name, full name. And those are both about baseball and Giamatti's time as president of the National League and then commissioner. And the role that he played in terms of, and the things he talked about in terms of cheating and what Pete Rose really meant. And what he it wasn't just that Rose lied and was wrong and violated the rules. It was more than that. It was that Rose was the beginning of something else. And that's something Giamatti understood. He could see what was coming, which was cheating. And he talked about that at great length at a speech he gave at University of Michigan Law School. He gave 3 lectures. And in the first 2, he deals with cheating. And that's part of what the articles talk about. He could anticipate what the Houston Astros and the Boston Red Sox and others did later. So I do deal with baseball. Baseball is also dealt with periodically throughout the book for reasons you alluded to. I read from part of it, but there are 3 or 4 other places where you could see what was coming. It was no surprise. Giamatti understood these principles about fairness since childhood. And so Pete Rose was a tough guy. Well, Giamatti had dealt with tough guys, and he dealt with tough guys at Yale too. And so he was prepared. There was nothing about this that was, they may have been from 2 different worlds ethically, but Bart Giamatti understood who Pete Rose was. So I have written a couple of articles. Myself and some colleagues are working on a podcast that will likely come out in the spring that will deal with baseball in more detail. I did spend time at at Cooperstown. They couldn't have been nicer to me. Actually, the reading room where you go in to do this research is called the Bart Giamatti Reading Room. And he founded it and created it and encouraged it. So there already is some work I've done on baseball that's public, and there will be more to come. With respect to Yale, I will be doing some articles. And I want to be careful because the thoroughness with which I approach this book, there are over 100 pages of endnotes, and they almost read like a parallel book. I want to be thorough. And in the absence of the papers, I'm just trying to be very careful and fair to him and fair to others too. So I don't know if that answers your question, but there's a lot more than I didn't end.
Yeah.
When I got to him, there's really quite a bit in there, including things he did in New Haven to undo the harm his predecessors had caused.
Yes, this is true. So I just sent out in the chat the URL for Neil Proto's website, which is www.neilthomasproto.com, and I recommend that's a great place to go for more information about these stories. We have a kind of a question that came in through the chat. Let's see if I can get back to it. It's from Carolyn Hunahan. And Carolyn says, she says basically that she also remembers what happened, the urban renewal of the 1950s. She wonders if anyone remembers, for example, a specific vendor who was called Hank the Eggman. I don't know if anyone else in our audience is from New Haven, or maybe Neil, you might remember him. And Carolyn also mentions that when she studied urban planning, urban renewal in college, her professors talked about urban renewal in New Haven, as a case study. And they didn't say anything about Yale, standing to benefit from what happened, but it was always in terms of the buildings were infested with vermin, and this was all for the benefit of the people who had been living there. They were going to be provided with better accommodations.
Jonathan, let me say something. I'm not surprised. That was a thread that Dick Lee promoted every way he could, except the reality on the ground was quite different. And the notion of poor housing, dilapidated housing, risky housing was not only confined to a small area, but Dick Lee doesn't talk about that until Robert Dahl's book, Who Governs? And that book doesn't come out until 1960 or so, 60, 61. Lee doesn't make these observations about what he witnessed that gave rise to his need for urban renewal until 6 or 7 years after all the harm was done. Somehow and Dahl buys off on it, hook, line, and sinker, to use a conventional and not very complimentary description. And it's not intended to be complimentary. I think when you look closely at the way Dahl not only treated Dick Lee, but he was on the Yale faculty at the time. And he actually submits drafts of his work to the president of Yale so he can review them first and be sure that it works for him and it's all done properly. Dahl was either naive, he certainly didn't understand politics, but he really covered up an awful thing that was going on in New Haven. And again, in the book, and here you just have to look at the Yale archives, or you have to look at the archives of the New Haven newspapers, and or Dick Lee's archives, and I've done all of those. If you can see that there were hundreds of buildings, office buildings, had nothing wrong with them. They were thriving, and all torn down. So it bore no relationship to all that mythology that got generated in a lot of universities and a lot of schools in the country, buying off on Robert Dahl and who he was and how he elevated Dick Lee. And the book talks about the way Lee really exploited that as best he could. And you could see the racism, the anti-immigrant, especially, mentality that comes out of the Ford Foundation, that comes out of Carnegie, that comes out of these other large institutions. There couldn't be more explicit about it. And it's in the book. But I didn't have to go looking very far for this. I just had to keep digging deeper. And so you have to abandon the mythology. And let me just add to this, and I don't mean to keep going on, Jonathan, because I'm hopefully there's some other questions. Yeah. But the Yale historians are not very good at it. They're not very honest either. No. And so you have to be very careful when you're reading their stuff. It really is intended to shift the blame, to shift it away from Yale. All you got to do is look at the current state of affairs to see how much they benefited from urban renewal, and it was deliberate. It was done deliberately. Mm.
Well, how did you decide to write about Bart Giamatti in the first place? Did you know him?
Yes, and I really begin the book with the way I met him. Why don't you go to that first photo, that other photograph, Jonathan, that we agreed you would include, yeah. Which is, and let me say a couple of things about it, which might be of interest to your viewers. This is Woolsey Hall on January 1st of 1980. Giamatti had very quietly, discreetly, about a year before this event, had a meeting with Ben DeLito while he was a candidate for mayor. And they talked privately, developed a friendship. DeLito, of course, went on to win. And Giamatti offered Woolsey Hall as the place of the inauguration. And he sat on stage. Now, I was the general chair of the inauguration. And so I met with Bart before the event itself so we could talk about his place on stage and so on. So a couple of things about this photograph are worth pointing out. Directly behind Giamatti is Ella Grasso. She was on stage as well. And she gave, of course, an opening talk, really to praise DeLito mostly, but she was a student at Mount Holyoke. And Ella Grasso, she had just been elected governor, And of course, as many of you know, she wasn't in office very long before she got cancer and died. But she had been a student at Mount Holyoke, and she was in the graduate program when the Giamattis came to Mount Holyoke. And she actually was a babysitter for Bart Giamatti when he was a little kid, and his sister too, Elria. So there's a much deeper relationship reflected here in this photograph between Bart and Ella Grasso. Also, he's holding in his hand a program booklet. And that booklet, you can see, you'd have to look really closely, but there is there in the back on the left-hand side, or at least my left as I'm looking at it, a replica of the sort of the skyline, yes, that's it, the skyline of New Haven and the skyline of Yale melded together. And it was a very deliberate effort on our part, and the mayor was very supportive of this, which was a cooperative relationship with Yale, but with some definite policy objectives in mind for New Haven, and to really make the most of Giamatti's commitment as in many respects, a lifelong resident of New Haven, but still with family there when he came, his commitment to the city. And so this photograph actually, as I'm describing it, begins to tell you something about his presidency. So that's how I met him.
Okay.
And we continue to have a friendship throughout that time period.
He was, it strikes me that there's a cliche that really does apply to him. People talk about so-and-so is a Renaissance man. Well, not only was he a scholar of Renaissance literature, but he was someone who was broad enough as a human being that he could be a scholar and be an administrator and academic politician and go on to exercise leadership in baseball, which seems like it's 180 degrees away. And if I remember correctly, he died at the age of 51. Mm-hmm. So that was really a lot to accomplish in a very short life. He seems to have been a remarkable person.
Let me just say this, Jonathan. If it's that was not actually a question, but if you don't mind, I'll make it into a question and answer it if I could. There's something, and I'm sure people in your audience will appreciate this. Giamatti was very close to the immigrant experience. He wasn't finished yet in terms of his family's place in America. He was still moving. He was still in progress. And there are a number of times in the book when I talk about that, and there's actually a couple of great quotes from him that are very relevant in this setting, but it really had to do with constantly moving, never being finished. Were important to him. They were an important part of his life. And I actually have, I have it in here as well. I'm not sure I can find it easily, but a great quote from Dr. Tony Fauci, who I knew or know, and Tony was getting an award, and he made this statement, and it's so powerful because he's talking about the way he was raised. And the interesting thing about it is the way he ends it by saying, somehow I felt I wasn't doing enough. And he says that, this is maybe 6 or 8 years ago now, but I quote it in the book at the head of one of the chapters, and it's so reflective of a mentality. It's an immigrant mentality. It has to do, I say that in the most powerfully positive ways possible. It has to do with still finding your place, still trying to move forward. And why? Well, you're still reflecting who are your parents, who are your grandparents, what did they go through? You're still trying to create that. You still have a sense of obligation to create that. That was Giamatti.
That's amazing. So let's see. I would encourage everybody to send in any questions that you might have through the chat function of the Zoom program here. I would, of course, urge everybody who can get hold of a copy to read Fearless, A. Bartlett Giamatti, and the Battle for Fairness in America. There's a couple of copies in our library system. And as I have said sometimes before, this would be a book worthy of being purchased, so you might add it to your personal library. Let's see, what have I forgotten to ask you about or talk about in your book, Neil?
Wilbur Cross.
Oh yeah.
We were going to talk about Wilbur Cross.
Oh yeah, let me bring up that picture too. Yeah, there he is.
This was probably one of the most profound and disappointing surprises to me. I actually went to Wilbur Cross High School. Let me say that right at the beginning, in New Haven.
And that was one of those York Square high schools.
Originally it was, before they closed it down. And it was in wonderfully good condition. It was very sad. My brother Richard, this article is also on one of the websites. My brother Richard played for basketball at Wilbur Cross when the school was still on the York Square campus. And in 1958, when he played, the team won the district, the Connecticut, and then the New England high school basketball championships. It was the last year they were there. So that campus had enormous meaning, not only for, well, certainly for my brother, for me. But by the time I went to Wilbur Cross, it had moved where it is now. So Wilbur Cross, for those of you who don't know, Cross was a faculty member at Yale. He was a professor of English. While he was a professor of English in 1913, so this is even before the president of Yale makes his Armenian massacre comment, Wilbur Cross went south. He took a group of people south, and they went to South Carolina. And he spent his time complimenting John C. Calhoun's heritage, his history, and how he was the most prominent graduate from the South at Yale University. He was a Yale graduate. And at the time, Yale was in the process of constructing Wolsey Hall. And as some of you may know, in Wolsey Hall, in the foyer area, there's a list of Yale graduates who participated and died in various wars, including the Civil War. And Yale was in the process of constructing that part of the foyer area. They intended, and actually did do, they intended to include in that list of Yale graduates the Confederate soldiers. And to do it without separating them out, but just as if they died like Union soldiers did in the Civil War. Well, in order to raise money and to solicit support and help from the South, Wilbur Cross goes south and he explains exactly what I just described to you. This is their intention. The Southerners love it. As far as they're concerned, it means that Yale is embracing the Confederacy and everything that occurred in the South during the war. And all of this comes out of the Yale archives. You wouldn't know it from anything they've ever written. But then Wilbur Cross continues on this same thread. He gives a speech at Brown University while he's a faculty member. He supports the creation of a secretary of eugenics in the United States. He wants the country to embrace this notion and idea of institutionalizing people and sterilization, which incidentally was mostly directed at women. So when Wilbur Cross becomes governor, he first of all goes back to Yale, and he is the master of ceremonies at a grand opening of what was called the Institute for Human Relations. And this is where he and President Angell come together. And this is where Yale creates its institute for the purpose of studying largely Italians, Jews, and Blacks. But most importantly, this is where eugenics takes a real institutional hold at Yale. And so when Wilbur Cross becomes the governor, he does institute a study. The study is intended to expand the eugenics laws that already existed in Connecticut, and he is a strong advocate for it. And during his time period, the number of people who are sterilized was its highest in Connecticut's history during this era of eugenics laws. And the laws existed in many places in the country. Indiana was the first in the nation to do it around 1911. Connecticut followed. So it was right up there. And being unfit, you could have bad eyesight, you could have bad hearing, you could have epilepsy, you might be autistic. The list was pretty endless, and it all depended on the doctor. And so there was a lot of arbitrary stuff that was done, and families harmed, shamed. Connecticut is one of the states, at least in my research, that never apologized. Some states have for what they did and for how long they did it. And it didn't expand in Connecticut because Wilbur Cross died. It was defeated. And then eventually he died shortly after that, but he was defeated, and that's what ended his, not the eugenics program, but the expansion of the eugenics program. So for reasons that truly elude me now, recognizing him in any positive way at all is something that is worth someone's attention, maybe the state legislature, if they wanted to do it. But it's all there in the book. It's all documented. It comes out of Yale's own archives and his personal archives as well.
Right.
That's
something to think about when we're driving on the Wilbur Cross Parkway.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. Since we were talking about Calhoun, I guess that this was after Wilbur Cross's time, but and you talk about this in the book about how Yale came to name a residential college after John C. Calhoun. Maybe it was.
Well, Calhoun had this long history, you see, that was not talked about in 1933 and 4 when that name was. When Yale finally went, this was after Val Giamatti left. Yale then finally went to these residential colleges.
Yeah. And
one of them was named after Calhoun. And he was not, incidentally, the only slave owner whose name still adores a Yale college. But it really goes back to Wilbur Cross in 1913 and this embrace of Calhoun, embrace of the South, and the way it stays at Yale, and then his name is logical. It just flows from what Yale was about. And that's how he got, to me, that's how, I think the documentation substantiates that. And
sure.
they were so reluctant to change it. Oh my gosh, it wasn't really until, not that only a few years ago, when there was such student anger over it. At first, the current president, wouldn't change it. And it was only after some faculty members really were critical of him that he finally got around to stepping up and changing what he needed to.
Right, and now it's named after Grace Murray Hopper. I believe she was an admiral and darn good thing, you know.
Yes, indeed.
Change in the right direction. Let's see, here's another question. And before I get to the question, it's Vicki Lucarelli just saying thank you for sharing this amazing history of New Haven and Mr. Giamatti. But here's a question from Carolyn Hunahan. And I'm sorry if I'm murdering your name, but did Mr. Proto interview Paul, Bart's son? And did he have an opinion about Mr. Proto's book?
No and no.
Okay.
I talked to his son, Marcus. He has an older son, Marcus. We've had some email exchanges. He's been very complimentary about the book. But no, Paul was not available. And if you look closely at the history I did cover, Paul was born at the very end of that.
Yeah.
And so he wasn't really irrelevant. He didn't really play into what I was writing about or the history I was trying to embrace. For that, I was able to spend a lot of time with with Bart's brother, Dino, his sister, Elria, her husband, David, who also was a childhood friend of Bart's, and then a lot of cousins, and of course his childhood friends, and then older friends, and faculty members at Princeton, where he taught right after Yale, and then later with some faculty members at Yale. Now, but let me come back to Paul.
Yep.
And that is, one of the most engaging parts of the book is the history of theater and the way Bart's mother and father, separately and then together at a couple of occasions, so embraced theater in their lives as participants. That is, they wrote plays, they acted in plays. Bart's father used theater in education, in teaching, and there's some wonderful old photographs I found at Yale of Bart's father actually being an actor in plays that were all in Italian. They were not English plays about Italians. They were all in Italian, written in Italy. So theater was an important part of their lives. Bart also embraced theater. He was a member of the Yale Dramatic Association when he was at Yale. His wife was at the Yale Drama School. And so theater was a critical part of that. So, and both sons, both Paul and Marcus, both became actors, although Bart had died before then. And, but they both, so there's a lineage, and it's developed quite extensively in the book. So for your viewers who follow Paul especially, I think they would enjoy those parts of the book where you could see how important theater was in the lives of grandparents, parents, and now these children.
The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, as they say.
Yes.
And somebody who played the real life diverse roles that Bart Giamatti did, you're not surprised to find out that he also might have dabbled in acting from time to time. That's fantastic. Thank you, Neil. I think it's gotten to be a little after 8 o'clock, and so it's probably time to bring this to a close. But I want to thank our guest Neil Thomas Proto very much for coming and talking to us. Thank you all for coming, and especially for coming back when we were interrupted in the middle. And our next talk will be on January 25th. It'll be the author of a book called Free the Beaches. So I hope many of you will come back for that. And so without further ado, thank you all, and I hope to see you all again soon.
Great. Good night, Jonathan. Thank you. Thank you all very much.
Good night, Neil. Good night, everybody.